This video was sponsored by Ground News.
All right, here he coming. Time to shooting now, please, I hope.
Friday works for me. I'll call you at that time and place. But in the meantime, keep it real, babe.
I want you to think about something. The spot where you're sitting, every square foot of ground in this country was stolen from my ancestors. And after you stole it, you murdered them. So you'll forgive us if we do not laugh along. There is nothing funny about the extermination of a people.
How do you feel about the following phrase? Hollywood perpetuates pro-American propaganda, not just at home, but across the globe. If you're American, does it make you defensive? The land of the free, propagating lies to make itself look better? Hollywood's a liberal institution, isn't it? How could you say that? Or maybe you look a bit more into it and start to feel betrayed. Like, fuck, really? The CIA changed the ending of the animated adaptation of Animal Farm to make it pro-American and take out any anti-capitalist subtext? Or perhaps your response is more cynical. Yeah, and Walt Disney made racist, pro-war propaganda that was also anti-Nazi, but then called his employees commies and blacklisted the ones who went on strike. What about it? And in the end, you might think similarly. So what? Well, in this video, I'd like to look into why Hollywood soft power and pro-US propaganda in mainstream entertainment matters, specifically in that it affects what art can be made and what messages artists can send, and how it's more subtle than you might think due to imperial core privilege, which makes any form of mainstream American entertainment media more prestige-worthy and powerful in comparison with art made from outside of the imperial core, simply by virtue of being from the US, and thus, whether purposefully or not, Hollywood and American celebrities benefit from that privilege and work to uplift US society and culture as default. In other words, with great soft power comes great responsibility. So, in the first part of this video, we'll be talking about intentional and known cases of government interference in Hollywood media, as well as ways in which the US likes to sanitize its own history for American and foreign audiences. And in the second part, we'll be discussing the ramifications of soft power when it comes to exporting US culture abroad, how simply by being American, celebrities, brands, and other iconography is seen as better, but also the complexities of internalizing this rhetoric, cross-cultural exchange and appropriation, how US media affects local media markets, and lastly, how Hollywood as an institution purposefully excludes non-English speaking, non-American, and non-white artists and entertainers from receiving the US Golden Seal of Approval and bump that their American counterparts enjoy. So let's get into it. Propaganda is made with intent, with a certain type of political bias to sway public opinion. In the case of American mass media, the bias is pro-war, and thus, when war films are made in the US, specifically by big Hollywood studios like Disney, the government and military works closely to make sure they're being portrayed in a favorable light, even having the final say on scripts in exchange for using real military-grade props, access to shooting locations, and being able to use the government agency names like FBI. This was the case for WandaVision, which was given the green light by the Pentagon. Journalist Akin Ola writes for The Guardian, "The end credits of WandaVision imply that the Pentagon had a final say on the script, and it makes sense that the inclusion of a friendly government agent as a character could offset the show's otherwise negative portrayal of the country's agencies." WandaVision's helicopters and Humvees were most likely provided free of charge by the US government. Of course, this equipment isn't actually free. The American public is effectively paying Hollywood to create propaganda that aims to sugarcoat the crimes of its military and intelligence apparatuses. Funding that could be used for disaster relief and healthcare is being used to recruit young people to die and kill in other countries for the sake of corporate interests. And it doesn't stop there. Akinola writes, Movies give the Pentagon total script approval rights in trade for the use of large amounts of military equipment. For example, Top Gun, the highest-grossing movie of 1986, gave the Navy the ability to rewrite parts of the original screenplay in exchange for access to fighter jets and aircraft carriers. As a result of the positive portrayal, the Navy saw a 500% increase in enlistments the year of its release. Marvel's Captain Marvel followed in its footsteps. The studio partnered with the Air Force to use the movie as a tool to boost recruitment of female pilots. The military succeeded again last year, seeing a modest bump in the percentage of female applicants. And this goes further back than Disney and Marvel. The first Best Picture Oscar winner was 1927's Wings, a war movie created with support from the U.S. Armed Forces. There are even departments within the Department of Defense that solely exist to work with Hollywood, Ola says. Philip Strubb, the Pentagon's former deputy director of entertainment media, its chief liaison with filmmakers, described his role as encouraging entertainment media producers to create or increase positive and reasonably accurate U.S. military portrayals in their projects while remaining mindful of their creative process. The department continually seeks out new ways to capitalize on innovations in entertainment media to inform the American public about the military and/or benefit military recruiting and retention. Basically, on the outside, it looks like the Pentagon and other government agencies are just fact-checking and assuring 100% accuracy in exchange for some realistic props. But in actuality, what they really want is to increase positive sentiment towards the U.S. military and government policing agencies. Historically, in the U.S., there was a strong anti-war sentiment post-World War I, but after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, it was easy to push pro-American and pro-enlistment propaganda, after which even the conservative Isolationist America First Committee changed its tune to pro-war. Dan O'Meara, a political science professor at the University of Quebec and co-author of Movies, Myth, and the National Security State, said to CBC in 2022, "In the 1940s, something like 90 million Americans were going to movies every week. In a pre-TV age, movies were the most important aspect of public entertainment. That you would go, sit in the dark, surrounded by hundreds of others seeing the same films across America at the same time, and all of the emotions evoked on screen were shared communally." Disney, as well as Warner Brothers, worked with the U.S. government to make propaganda films during this era. The topics ranged from getting the public to buy war bonds, to enlist, and most importantly, to boost morale against the Nazis by depicting them as losers, which, honestly, good for them, though a lot of the propaganda reduced nations down to stereotypes, specifically anti-Japanese stereotypes. And this echoes what's happening in the news today. Sensationalist stories about immigrants are once again being pushed out by politicians in order to make headlines. These stories appeal to our gut reactions for clicks, rather than getting us to use our critical thinking skills to understand why someone would make up a story like this and what agenda they might have. The news today is so overrun by hyperbole, it's hard to really tell what's worth our time or not. I've been using a tool to cut through the noise, and I'm proud to introduce the sponsor of today's video, Ground News. Ground News was founded by a former NASA engineer to help readers navigate the complex media landscape by gathering articles from over 50,000 sources worldwide. It allows you to compare coverage of the same story across outlets while providing context on each source's political bias, reliability, and ownership, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitors. For example, take a look at this story. Trump says migrants who have committed murder have introduced a lot of bad genes into our country. It has been covered by more than 60 sources. On the bias distribution of the sources reporting it shows that 48% lean left and 29% lean right. If you scroll down, you can see every article about this topic and compare headlines. This article from the left-leaning News Corp calls Trump racist in the headline, while the conservative right-leaning headline from the Washington Examiner focuses on illegal immigrants, illustrating how different political sides view Trump's comments as well as how they view immigrants. This shows us that one article could not possibly fit all of these perspectives. One of my favorite features of Ground News is the blind spot feature, which displays stories that are disproportionately reported on by either side of the political spectrum. Check out this story about a U.S. court that's set to review a civil rights lawsuit alleging environmental racism in a Louisiana parish. The suit is over racist land use policies put in place in order to pollute majority black communities. It has been covered by 7 left-leaning sources and 0 right-leaning sources. These are stories you could have missed in your media bubble. In all, I've been really enjoying Ground News and find it extremely helpful as someone who primarily got my news from Twitter, where most news was told in a way that was just focused on getting getting the most clicks and outrage. I love having control over what I read, and Ground News helps me do that by showing me how news stories are framed differently, and where bias comes into play. It makes staying informed so much easier without getting overwhelmed. So go to groundnews.com/Lynn to give it a try. If you sign up through my link, you'll get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is what I use to get unlimited access to all features. I think Ground News is doing important work and will help you be able to exercise your media literacy skills, and I hope you'll check them out. Now back to the video. Walt Disney specifically needed this type of funding in order to help the company out of debt. And it also helped that the government sent him out of the country on a goodwill tour of Latin America as his workers were on strike, and he really didn't want to deal with that. On his 1941 tour of Latin America, Walt and his artists helped spread the good neighbor policy of trying to create allies in South America, specifically in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, as those in South America were growing suspicious of the US due to their heavy influence in the Caribbean and Central America. According to the American Historical Association, South Americans whose affairs had not yet been directly affected by our interventions in the Caribbean area became suspicious of us. There was much talk over all of Latin America of creating a solid bloc of nations to combat the growing menace of North American imperialism. While Walt was there, he and El Grupo, his group of artists and writers, embraced each country's culture, created specific characters based on each country, including Zé Carioca from Brazil, but in the end it was still very one-sided. Though the Disney films that came out of the tour helped to expose American audiences to South America, it was all still through a white US lens that depended on the exotification of a place that most people have never been to, and in the end this was all for the US's benefit, not just the propaganda but the good neighbor policy. To get allies in South America was to benefit the US, to exploit South America and make them bow down to imperialism, which was already happening as Ford exploited rubber and labor from the Amazon, and Johnson & Johnson did the same, but with carnaúba wax, which comes from a specific palm tree here in the northeast of Brazil. Though the workers in Fordlandia did end up revolting and not converting to Ford's idea of Christianity, and Johnson & Johnson eventually left after finding alternatives to carnaúba wax, which was very labor-intensive to retrieve, they still left a mark on the nation. The goodwill tour of Latin America reminds me personally a lot of the movie Up, in that it's uncritical about the exotification of South America and how there's no people in the movie, just exotic made-up animals. I remember being shown Disney's anti-Nazi cartoons in high school as if they were some really bad and naughty stuff Disney did, but my initial impression and my impression to this day is still the same. So what? Isn't anti-Nazi propaganda a good thing? I guess they were bad in that they depicted racist caricatures, but if that was supposed to be the big takeaway, my teachers didn't need to look at outright propaganda made with the government seal of approval. Just look at any of Disney's earlier works, and in most you'll find racially insensitive portrayals of minorities, showing that soft power propaganda doesn't have to be only art made with the help from the government, but just most early American art made by white people. Exporting racist stereotypes in Dumbo, Song of the South, Peter Pan, and later Aladdin and Pocahontas is just par for the course when it comes to Disney animation. Nick Cull, a professor of public diplomacy at the University of Southern California, who has written several books on the history of propaganda, said to the CBC in the same article, the US government wanted to ensure that those shared communal feelings supported America's participation in the war, in part because it was worried that its enemies would expose negative aspects of American society to Americans themselves. The US had to help win the war to protect its own propaganda state. In fact, after World War II in 1945, British author George Orwell published one of his most famous works, Animal Farm. During the 1950s, production began on an animated retelling, and the film debuted in 1954. It was produced by Hallison Batchelor, a British animation studio, and funded in part by the CIA, who also made changes to the original script. Specifically that there should be good and bad farmers, because investors didn't want to offend American audiences involved in farming, and because, in my opinion, the CIA wanted to make sure audiences knew that this wasn't a systemic problem. See, there's good oppressors too. They wanted to write the story to blame the mismanagement of the farm on one bad apple, on one bad human. According to the CBC, it wasn't until 4 decades later, when Cold War historian Tony Shaw was going through archives about the classic novel, that it came to light that the CIA secretly purchased the film rights and subsequently turned the story into a propaganda project, entirely revising the ending so the pigs, who represent communist masters, are overthrown by the other animals on the farm. Though I would argue the pigs don't represent communist masters, but rather capitalistic greed, and that the parable of Animal Farm is more about not becoming the new oppressor during a revolution, not that revolutions are pointless and that we need to change the ending so that the good guys win. But that's what American audiences supposedly like, right? Happy endings. Ironically, however, the film did poorly at the box office, but did end up making its way into American school classrooms, at least for a little while. According to Shaw, this rescripting was intended by the CIA to act as some sort of symbol or inspiration for revolution among people living in Eastern Bloc countries against their communist leaders, but it was equally designed for the soft left in Western Europe. Though again, I don't think it was that effective, seeing that Orwell's written work is studied more today than the rewritten and corrupted CIA reimagining. But in general, post-World War II, it was easy to make the US out to be the good guys. There was a clear enemy during the war. The US ended up on the right side of history, even though they only entered the war out of their own self-interest and were openly anti-Semitic, even turning boats of refugees away and interned 120,000 Japanese Americans. But in the end, the country economically and militarily made it out unscathed, and that's what matters, right? The US was stronger than ever, unlike Europe and Japan that had to spend the next decades rebuilding, with US aid packages to boot. Total US assistance to Japan for the years of the occupation from 1946 to 1952 was roughly $2.2 billion. In 2005, that's around $15.2 billion, of which almost $1.7 billion was grants and $504 million was loans. Through the Marshall Plan, the U.S. transferred $13.3 billion, equivalent to $173.8 billion in 2024, in economic recovery programs to Western European economies after the end of World War II. The U.S. ensured they not only survived the war, but thrived in a post-war economy through the beginning of mass consumption, and continued to try to use the media to boost U.S. morale through the Cold War, which was fueled by proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam. Allegedly, famed Western star and known horrible person John Wayne personally wrote to U.S. President Lyndon Johnson to ask the government to help him make a propaganda film about the conflict in Vietnam, says Tanner Mearleys, an associate professor of communication and digital media studies at Ontario University. The Pentagon supplied props and military bases for the movie and retained final script approval. The movie that would later result from Wayne's effort was the 1968 film The Green Berets, in which it was later learned that the atrocities attributed to the Northern Vietnamese in the film were actually committed by American troops during the war. Roger Ebert in 1968 famously gave the film 0 stars. The Green Berets simply will not do as a film about the war in Vietnam. It's offensive not only to those who oppose American policy, but even to those who support it. At this moment in our history, locked in the longest and one of the most controversial wars we have ever fought, what we certainly do not need is a movie depicting Vietnam in terms of cowboys and Indians. That is cruel and dishonest and unworthy of the thousands who have died there. Perhaps we could have believed this film in 1962 or 63, when most of us didn't much care what was happening in Vietnam. But we cannot believe it today, not after television has brought the reality of the war to us, not after the Fulbright hearings and the congressional debates and the primaries, not after 23,000 Americans have been killed. And even when Hollywood films claim to be anti-war, they still end up aggrandizing it. And though part of that is because audiences will take what they want away from a film, and because war films trigger our adrenaline, watch It's Just Cinema's amazing video here, it doesn't mean that American filmmakers are totally unbiased either. Full Metal Jacket from 1987 may be a harrowing look into how war changes a man's psyche, but how good of a job does it really do when most people just love to quote the "me so horny" line? Or when 1979's Apocalypse Now's most famous line is "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." Ironically, though 1994's Forrest Gump is a love letter to the US and vintage Americana, it at least shows how pointless Vietnam was and how horribly veterans are treated, especially when they become disabled from the same war that they were told to fight in. Though I would be remiss to not mention that Forrest Gump is still American propaganda in that it wants us to stick with the status quo and paints counterculture and liberation movements as pointless. See Broe Deschanel's newest video here. Lieutenant Dan doesn't need to rebel against the government and God, he just needs Forrest to give him a higher purpose. The anti-war movement of the 1960s, as well as news coverage of the war, changed the perception of the US for many and created a sense of disillusionment, and rightfully so. The Vietnam War raged on for 20 years from November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975, and was fought not just in North and South Vietnam, but in Cambodia and Laos, which resulted in 2 million civilian deaths of all nationalities. For the rest of the Cold War, attention in mainstream American entertainment media was turned on the Soviets, as seen in Red Dawn and Rocky IV, as well as TV programming promoting the police, as seen in Cops from 1989, and Law & Order, which debuted in 1990. Aliens and disaster movies would also become popular motifs in film. See Independence Day, Twister, and even Titanic. And please note, I'm oversimplifying here for time, but commies, mainly Russians, were always depicted as bad guys since the onset of the Cold War, but there was a centering on them post-Vietnam after popular opinion turned anti-war. The same with aliens and monsters as metaphors for foreign threats and racial others. Pearl Harbor was released in May of 2001 as a callback to American patriotism, and wouldn't you know it, a revitalization of pro-war sentiment would be sparked that same year after the September 11th attacks. In October of 2002, the U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution that granted Bush the power to use military force against the Iraqi government. The Iraq War officially began on the 20th of March 2003, when the U.S., joined by the UK, Australia, and Poland, launched a shock and awe bombing campaign. In popular American media during the fallout of 9/11, so-called liberal Hollywood was predominantly pro-war, with Michael Moore being booed at the Oscars in 2003 for making anti-war and anti-Bush remarks, and the Dixie Chicks being blacklisted that same year after publicly criticizing the president and not supporting the war. Being anti-war after 9/11 was a sign that you were unpatriotic, and just as bad as a terrorist. Even Trey Parker's Team America, which at first makes fun of the US as the world police, still takes a conservative turn in the end, when they show that Team America is very much needed to save us from Kim Jong-il, who is voiced by Parker and speaks in a stereotypical Asian accent. It got so ridiculous that a North Carolina restaurant renamed French fries to Freedom Fries after France openly opposed the war in Iraq. If you don't openly love the US, it leads people to think you're un-American, and due to the long history of government-made propaganda, that becomes unimaginable. The mindset of most Americans is that the US is the best country in the world. The military is keeping us safe. Why are you complaining? Shut up and eat your freedom fries. During this time, almost everyone was forced to confess how they felt about the attacks in order to show how much they loved their country, including child stars on the Disney Channel.
Everywhere you go, there's nationalism. Every single state.
I love driving down the road and seeing flags outside of people's houses. I love it. It makes me feel really, really proud to live here.
I think it's necessary to be proud of your country.
Everyone is flying the American flag, and the American flag stands for everything that we stand for as Americans.
Everyone around the country is appreciating freedom a lot more.
We're all American now, you know? That is so beautiful. I love it.
The channel's pro-9/11 movie Tiger Cruise came out in 2003 starring Hayden Panettiere, who after the Twin Towers fall decides to support her father's continuation in the armed forces. After September 11th, it seemed like all that fear-mongering from the Cold War was finally coming to fruition. Some people felt vindicated and eager to enlist. Like, we might live in a propaganda state, but they're not wrong, everyone does hate us, without actually questioning why people don't support the US as much as those within its borders. The surge of patriotism and an unwavering love of America is something we're still feeling today, with celebrities and artists being fired from projects for being outspoken against Israel and the genocide in Gaza. Though we'd like to think of Hollywood as a liberal institution, I know many conservatives view it that way, most of Hollywood just wants to uphold the status quo, and under the two-party system in the US, upholding the status quo is just upholding liberalism. It's believing in the American dream, believing in nationalism, and that the US is the best country in the world and worth fighting for and preserving, and saying anything contrary to that would be treasonous. It's SNL comedian Norm Macdonald bringing out Johnny Two Feathers, whose real name is John Scott Richardson, to make fun of Marlon Brando's refusal to accept the Oscar for Best Actor in 1973, and then having liberal comedians like Jon Stewart and John Oliver laugh at the fact that Scott Richardson is telling them that they're on stolen land. In hindsight, I guess the joke was intended to be at the expense of Sacheen Littlefeather, whose Native American ancestry claim was dubious and whose own family dismissed her claim. Like, look at how silly she was. But John Scott Richardson is a Native American actor in Hollywood, and McDonald using him as a prop to make a point in front of your white colleagues, to me, is just weird and not funny, especially when he's talking about something as serious as a real genocide against Native American people and settler colonialism. Like, in the end, what is funny about this? What's the joke? It's making fun of Trump on SNL, but not actually wanting to challenge the idea of US supremacy. It's Hamilton 2024 singing about the general election and how the system does work and you should work with it. The lyrics go, "We need to coexist with our election system, it hasn't failed us yet. It's not perfect, but let's soften our objection." How could you say that with a straight face when our system let Donald Trump in the White House? In the end, most of those who work in the US entertainment industry aren't interested in pushing more challenging leftist ideas, not only because they're closely tied to the government for funding and there's a big risk in speaking out against the hand that feeds you, but also because Hollywood is a capitalistic institution and the wealthy want to stay wealthy and they're not actively invested in liberation and anti-capitalist politics that would dismantle the global hierarchy. That's not to say that every single filmmaker and entertainer in the US is a corporate government shill. There are artists who do use their platforms to reject nationalism and capitalism, but rather under capitalism that depends on military might and arms sales and army enlistment and patriotism, it's hard to ever fully remove oneself from that system. And thus, this makes it incredibly hard to make any type of revolutionary art stick in the mainstream to help audiences achieve a global consciousness. And though it's an open secret that big Hollywood studios and filmmakers since the 1920s to today work closely with the government to push pro-military and pro-war agendas, the knowledge of this doesn't really make an impact on profits or dissuade the public from supporting their favorite franchise. When it comes to the MCU, The Incredible Hulk from 2008 not only experienced censoring, but also military funding. Lily Fox wrote for the Institute of Youth and Policy that the censorship this movie went through in order to be able to receive any Department of Defense funding is disturbing. The military cut out any dialogue that referenced using guinea pigs as test subjects because it referred to actual experiments the military performed using human subjects, as well as a reference to Operation Ranch Hand, which was the military effort of dropping pesticides in Vietnam to starve the Viet Cong. If the military feels the need to cut out parts of a script due to those parts referencing the disgusting things they have actually done, then that is horrifying in terms of transparency as well as censorship. When it comes to Iron Man / Tony Stark, many people's favorite Avenger and hero, he basically is a spokesperson, at least in the beginning, for the US military-industrial complex, making the Iron Man suit because he did not think the US was doing enough in the Middle East. In fact, in exchange for use of their weaponry, Marvel Studios had to make sure that their script was fully approved by the Pentagon, which led to a few lines being cut from the original script. The author of National Security Cinema stated that without the Pentagon's support, it is possible that the Marvel Universe wouldn't have become the world's biggest film franchise. The first two Iron Man films benefited from over $1 billion worth of planes and equipment as props and set dressing. Some of the most iconic scenes in the films came as a result of military assistance. The film also relies heavily on American exceptionalism and paints the people in the Middle East as terrorists, which is a common trope in war movies set in the Middle East. When it comes to Captain America, it's a no-brainer that the US military would be behind the scenes. The US military actually worked with Marvel Studios in order to design the Captain America character. Because of this, the Army allowed Marvel Studios to film at Camp Edward. They thought that Captain America possesses the values of today's modern soldier, and thus they supported the film. The film also heavily promotes American patriotism, obviously enough, and even included historically inaccurate portrayals of the US military, such as having non-segregated battalions in order to make their image look better. However, I should note that this inaccuracy I think is also present in the comics, and maybe they thought they could have more wiggle room with the historical inaccuracies and just leeway in general because it's a superhero film and the antagonist is a guy that looks like the devil. But honestly, when I see Captain America being sold in Brazil and kids going around wearing Captain America shirts, it's a little weird, at least to me. Like, Captain America is seen as this great soldier and peacekeeper, peacekeeper and good guy, but the US military is actually far from that. And though the Falcon and Winter Soldier TV miniseries dives into that quite a bit, which is more than what's expected from Disney and Marvel, is that able to outshine the image we have of Chris Evans's Captain America portrayal in the Avengers film franchise? I don't have an answer for that, I'm just asking. Disney and Marvel are billion-dollar companies, and they have weaseled their way into every nook and cranny of the globe in order to completely dominate the international media landscape. Disney and Marvel movies alone have grossed $29.8 billion USD. Avengers has the best average with an average of $1.9 billion per film. The international box office is unsurprisingly mostly US Hollywood productions, including the Avatar series, Avengers Endgame, Fast and Furious 7, Star Wars Episode 7, and Frozen. When looking at where films gross the highest internationally, English-speaking countries like Australia and the UK come up, but also markets outside of the imperial core are prominent consumers. China and India, of course, are up there due to their large populations, but also Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Hungary, Poland, Russia, and Turkey are all places where Hollywood productions profit. And these studios in Hollywood not only dominate the media landscape for capital gain, but to push this idea of American exceptionalism and that the US is default and everything else is other. They push English-speaking media to the forefront in countries where English isn't the dominant language. They shove American entertainment media and imagery and iconography around the globe. While in the US mainstream, people struggle to even watch movies with subtitles, and most gawk at non-American productions. Watching a foreign film is a novelty in the US, a date night idea, not part of their daily media habits, at least for most. However, it should be noted that since the pandemic and streaming platforms, there has been an increase in American audiences choosing to watch non-US titles. Figures from Whip Media, a US company that runs a platform for worldwide content licensing, shows that the share of non-US titles viewed in the country has more than doubled from slightly less than 8% in 2018 to more than 16% in 2021. Not to mention that the demographics of the US have changed in that today about 1 in 5 people in the US speak a second language at home. That's 68 million people. So things are definitely changing in the US domestically and even internationally. Non-American productions and art are becoming more popular, but I'd still say US culture, films, and iconography are going strong and continue to reinforce English language dominance and establish an American worldview as the norm. For example, Iron Man portrays those in the Middle East as bad guys to US audiences, but also that has a global impact. How does the negative portrayal of the Middle East affect international viewers' perception of those areas and of those people? When big US film productions drench the Middle East, India, and Mexico in yellow, that's not only for American audiences to think of those places as dirty, it also sends a message to those living there that the US sees them as less than. And because American films have such a large reach, they dictate how the rest of the world views the US, but also how the US views the world. Much like how many films are made with the white male gaze in mind, depicting women in ways in which men would like to view them in order to cater to male audiences, and thus normalizing the patriarchy and how women view themselves, First World Imperial Core privilege works the same way. We internalize the US hegemonic worldview and normalize it for international audiences. The Middle East is our enemy. Latin America is dirty, corrupt, and backwards. Asia is a far-off mystical land, and Africa is the dark continent. This is also done through less intentional ways and in smaller scale ways, like through soft power and the proliferation of American media images on an international scale. For example, when shows like The Big Bang Theory make fun of India, it's not just for white American audiences to laugh at, it has an international reach. And though this is no fault of its own, as the sitcom wasn't meant to be for international audiences and didn't come out during the age of streaming, but even before it went online, The Big Bang Theory, believe it or not, became beloved around the world, and like The Avengers, it normalizes an American geopolitical and socio-cultural worldview. Indian food gives you diarrhea and is gross, people in India have dysentery and it's stinky and smelly, and Raj, the Indian character in the series, agrees with all that.
I don't want to go back to India. It's hot and loud and there's so many people.
That racist and xenophobic American worldview then gets pushed out to audiences around the world as funny, and to me that's not right, especially in a media landscape where most people, especially many of those in the US and those outside of India, may not be familiar with Indian media and entertainment. This isn't an equal media exchange. But I want to be clear here that those outside of the US who like and watch The Big Bang Theory and Friends and Marvel and Captain America and Taylor Swift don't partake in US media culture because they're brainwashed and are just quote-unquote stupid, but rather because they like all of this stuff, and that's fine. People are allowed to like art and entertainment, and those outside of the US can think for themselves and are able to question the pervasiveness of US media in their own countries, and oftentimes do. Even us in the US know that government intervention in our media is happening. It's not like some big secret, and many outside of the US don't even tune into US media and could care less about American culture and Hollywood, and millions prefer their own domestically produced entertainment. However, there is still a danger of normalizing the American gaze because the US views the rest of the world as inferior, and normalizing that and having others outside of the US internalize that is dangerous. There are conservatives, for example, in Brazil who do love the US and think that Brazil sucks and want to be more like the US, for example, to have the right to bear arms. There are some people across the world who do think that the US is just objectively better than where they currently live, and that's because of US propaganda and soft power, though I do think that's changing more and more each day. In the end, I just want to say here that there's a danger in infantilizing foreign audiences for not knowing or not caring about the pervasiveness and normalization of US media and culture in other parts of the globe, especially when it comes to racism. For example, a lot of American fans of Disney theme parks don't want Disney to take away the Last Splash Mountain ride and replace it with Tiana's Bayou Adventure in Tokyo Disneyland. There's rumors that they might retheme it, but as of now they're not planning on it. But a lot of the comments on the forums about Disney World and Disney parks usually go something like this: Japanese people don't care about racism, they're not woke like us, they don't know what Song of the South is, just leave the ride as is. And by reducing Japanese Disney fans to just ignorant, racist people who don't care about subtle racism is dismissive, especially of Black Japanese people who may not like the theming of the ride, as innocuous as it may be. Being dismissive of stupid foreign audiences lets Disney get away with leaving racially insensitive material up in other countries by just coasting on this belief that it's not harmful because the people there are too uneducated to question it, or even worse, too racist to care, while not realizing how the Disney company itself has contributed to global anti-Black sentiment, which Japan, as well as neighboring East Asian countries who visit Tokyo Disneyland, do harbor. And this works the other way as well. When the casting of Scarlett Johansson in Ghost in the Shell drew criticism from Asian Americans, they were drowned out by media outlets giving attention to Japanese fans who said they were excited to see a white woman portray a popular anime character, without understanding that Asian Americans were angry at whitewashing in Hollywood, where they're underrepresented, and that obviously Japanese people who see themselves represented in media all the time wouldn't care or be as angry as marginalized groups in the US. In both cases, nuances get lost in search for profit and upholding the status quo of the white American hegemonic gaze. We'll get into implicit soft power soon, but before that, I think we should look deeper into the US's history with censorship and Hollywood media, because it'll help us better understand why American media is the way it is and how the US portrays foreign and racial others. So during the dawn of American cinema during the 1920s and early 30s, art in Hollywood was quite liberal. Film curator Chelsea O'Brien told Australian Centre for Moving Image that Hollywood in the 1920s was a super racy time. Films were beginning to mature, they were dealing with adult content. So much so that by 1930, the motion picture production code known as the Hays Code was introduced in order to better control what people would see on screen and who could tell those stories. After the Wall Street crash of 1929 ended the affluence of the 1920s, movie makers were caught between the racy taste of the Jazz Age and the economic realities of the Depression, and films that slipped through the cracks reflected this duality. With less money in people's pockets for movie-going, studios tried luring audiences in with salacious films featuring sex, violence, drinking, and the grotesque, like Babyface, Scarface, and Freaks, whose storylines reflected glamorous gangsters, sexually liberated women, and class struggle. It's no wonder the Hays Code was conceived during this period. Commonly referred to by its shorthand name rather than its full title, the Hays Code was named after William H. Hays, who was the president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, MPPDA, at the time. The Hays Code was this self-imposed industry set of guidelines for all the motion pictures that were released between 1934 and 1968. The code prohibited profanity, suggestive nudity, graphic or realistic violence, sexual persuasions, and rape. It had rules around the use of crime, costume, dance, religion, national sentiment, and morality. And according to the code, even within the limits of pure love or realistic love, certain facts have been regarded as outside of the limits of safe presentation, meaning couples had to sleep in separate beds and miscegenation wasn't allowed. And this severely hurt actors of color who couldn't star in leading roles if there was a romantic subplot, which there almost always was, systemically removing Black, Brown, Native American, and Asian artists and actors from leading roles and relegating them as sidekicks, extras, and villains. However, during the time the code was implemented in 1930, it wasn't enforced until 1934, and thus during this short period, code stretching became the norm. O'Brien notes that filmmakers such as Dorothy Arzner continued to push the conservative boundaries of the new Hays Hollywood. As an openly queer filmmaker and the only female director active during Hollywood's golden age, she openly made feminist films like The First Talkie directed by a woman, The Wild Party, and Dance Girl Dance, the latter a code-stretching tale of burlesque dancers that challenged the male gaze and audiences. Though it's interesting to see how filmmakers at the time worked to get around film censorship and push the boundaries of conservatism, and the films made during the time of the Hays Code were still noteworthy, not to mention that the actors of colors themselves, like Dorothy Dandridge and Anna Mae Wong, were able to find footing in this new Hollywood. Generally, the Hays Code led to even more racial stereotyping when it came to white actors seeing someone's race as a costume. The Hays Code helped normalize yellow, red, brown, and blackface because white actors got to disappear into roles, while actors of color were generally kept out of the spotlight. And though this was such a long time ago, we still feel the effects of censorship to this day, with tropes like the black best friend character and comedic side character, with the normalization of white main characters, with the noble savage stereotype, and with Asian and other non-white actors continuing to put on accents for comedic effect. Due to the Hays Code in Hollywood, conservatism became the norm, and liberal or left-leaning attitudes became the exception. And this normalization of conservatism later became a perfect segue for government intervention in American art, in using the film industry to promote militarism and patriotism at home, but also as a soft power tool abroad to market the U.S. and normalize an American-dominant worldview. In this section, I'd like to delve into how the U.S., through the use of popular media, is able to rewrite its own history in order to maintain a positive image of the country at home and abroad, despite its horrific historical past with non-white people. First, domestically, the U.S. has committed and is continuing a genocide against Native American people. From deposing the Queen of Hawaii to cutting up Alaska to the Trail of Tears, re-education camps, and forced Christian conversion, ripping Native children away from their communities and giving wanted children up for adoption to white families, to the Wounded Knee Massacre, and so many other atrocities, the fact that we are on stolen land is the least the federal government could say, but unfortunately probably never will. But the government can't have its own population nor the rest of the world think about that when they think of America. It really puts a damper on the whole patriotism thing we have going on here. No, it's much better for those in the US and abroad to associate the nation with Mickey Mouse, iPhones, and New York City than genocide. So to achieve this end, Hollywood pumps out movies where there's a white savior or one good white guy that saves the day and rewrites actual history and all's right with the world. Through this art, the US is able to show that they have repented for the sins of the past, and even in the past, there were always good white people helping out to outweigh the bad ones, because that's how systemic oppression and privilege works. All of that Native American stuff is in the past. We're better now. And I want to note here that movies like Dances with Wolves and Pocahontas weren't made with the government as intentional domestic and international propaganda, but rather they're products of a society in which art is unquestionably patriotic and where its citizens are as well. In liberal Hollywood, there's this need to retell history in order to rid ourselves of guilt. But because it's all done selfishly, the art that gets the most mainstream attention from the Academy and the most financial backing will never go far enough to say all white people benefit from settler colonialism. The U.S. government should give land back to Native people because under a liberal framework, the system is good and we just need to get power in the hands of the good white people.
We will never forget what the Americans have done to us. Never! Never, never, never! The Americans, my people, are our enemies. And you must understand that. They are our enemies. They took our land. They imprisoned our queen. They banned our language. They forcibly made us a colony of the United States. America always says they are democratic. Lies! That is a lie! They have never been democratic with Native people. They have never been democratic with Indians. They have never been democratic with Hawaiians.
In the end, a lot of it is just liberal Hollywood BS trying to reconcile the fact that most of us were raised on films that heavily featured westerns and how the frontier needed to be tamed in the name of manifest destiny, and where cowboys and Indians was just a game, a fun genre, not life and death that portrayed one way of life and race as superior to the other. And though this has changed somewhat in the past century, like with Killers of the Flower Moon, and especially with the help of the internet and exposure of Native American filmmakers and artists, as well as a push for better representation and diversity in mainstream works, I'd say that things also haven't changed that much. I mean, Disney is still sending tourists, both American and those abroad, to Hawaii, but it's okay because they made Moana. But through these reductive images of the conflict with indigenous people in the US, it portrays the US as a place that can live up to its ideals of equality and freedom, or when this is all just in the past, when historically that's far from the truth. In fact, in reality, the US government has historically backed films that are historically racist against non-white people. A perfect example of this is the US federal government's backing and supporting of the 1915 film Birth of a Nation, which depicts the KKK lynching of a white actor in blackface trying to pursue a white woman. It depicts the US Civil War as a lost cause Confederacy tale in which Reconstruction ruined the South's natural order of white supremacy. According to the American Journal of Economics and Sociology article, The Historical Roots of the CIA and Hollywood Propaganda, the War Department even supported the white supremacist movie Birth of a Nation in 1915, and it was the first movie to be screened at the White House. Writer and professor Alexis Clark wrote for History, shortly after the LA launch of Birth of a Nation, Thomas Dixon Jr. convinced President Wilson to screen the movie inside the White House, arguably the first time that was ever done. President Wilson reportedly said of the film, "It's like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it's all so terribly true." The FBI decades later would launch a harassment campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. for fighting for racial equality and civil rights, and allegedly tried to prompt him to end his life. They dubbed him the most notorious liar in the country, and yet the US government loves to point to his monument that was only completed in 2019 and act as if it's all good now. And to the rest of the world, race relations and racial inequality, at least in mainstream Hollywood productions that are awarded on an international stage, are rewritten through a white person's perspective. See The Help, Green Book, The Blind Side, and even Freedom Writers from MTV. And though the narrative is changing with films like Judas and the Black Messiah, Moonlight, BlacKkKlansman, The Hate U Give, and Get Out garnering critical acclaim and mainstream support and international support, we still have a long way to go. But I will say the perception of the US abroad when it comes to race relations is changing, and the truth is harder to hide. Now, with the use of social media platforms, people in the US and around the world know how effed up the police system is, how black people are being executed in public by police officers and other civilians, and that's a good thing. I think we've all had enough of Hamilton and the overrepresentation of black cops in American media. Of course, black people in the US and in the wider diaspora already know this reality and have been trying to get non-black people to care about policing and racism and prison abolition for literal decades, but internationally, black American media that deals with race and class disparity has been extremely popular in places where black populations are high. One American phenomenon in Brazil is Everybody Hates Chris, the 2005 sitcom narrated by and about the life of comedian Chris Rock.
And so what is with all the Portuguese that we're seeing on your social media right now, Tyler?
Gosh.
What is happening?
I don't know. Okay, it must be some kind of game or something they do in Brazil or something like that. But apparently they got a hold of Everybody Hates Chris reruns, and that's their thing, is just flooding your timeline with Portuguese.
And I think it especially resonates with Brazilians due to the class aspect, but also the racial aspect. And in general, it's a funny show with a great cast, and I think also as representation goes, it's a majority black show, and representation is important for underrepresented groups. In countries like South Korea, Black American culture has found itself appropriated. And I should note here that cultural appropriation is a neutral term, like Black American soldiers stationed in South Korea during the Korean War introduced fried chicken to the population, and it's now taken on a life of its own. The problem is when the originators of the culture that's being appropriated are hypocritically looked down upon and discarded, as in the case of the South Korean entertainment industry that works closely with Black American artists when creating music, and who appropriate hip-hop, rap, and R&B for Korean and global audiences, and even don streetwear and at times braids, while also not knowing the full history or caring about where these influences come from. Though some of it can be deemed as appreciation, most of it is appropriation in the derogatory sense. And I made a few videos about this here, so I won't get too much into it, but it's been a long-standing issue with K-pop that's only recently started to be reckoned with. When it comes to minority American culture being taken by foreign artists, it's a tricky area to cover. Another example of this that comes to my mind is Bong Joon-ho's use of stereotypical Native American symbolism in Parasite. In an interview with director Bong Joon-ho, he said this about the Native American symbolism. It's kind of like that Che shirt that people wear just because it's cool. They have no real understanding of the actual history and the complicated context that surrounds Native Americans. It's just reduced to decor. And this is a spoiler, but a really important element of the film is the man who is living in the secret basement. In this story, it's like the protagonist infiltrates this rich family's house only to discover that there was someone already living there. And I think that's kind of related to the history of Native Americans as well. I didn't really intend this while I was writing the script, but in hindsight, I realized that some audience members may make that connection too. Essentially, the Kims are colonizing a house that's already hosting a couple of parasites. And for the rich Park family, they just see Native American stuff as decoration and fun, much like white Americans and non-Native Americans in general. I think how Native American iconography is handled in the film will be different for everyone, so let me know what you think about it down below. But generally, to me, it's interesting how minority cultures from the US are appropriated and appreciated and used and viewed abroad because marginalized experiences in art in the US are oppressed. And so when another nation takes them as their own or uses it as a motif in another work, it hits differently than when white American culture is uplifted or normalized like Captain America dolls or Mickey Mouse t-shirts. There's a power struggle with oppressed art that there isn't with privileged art. There's the fetishization of patriotic American culture and making fun of how we love our flag and can't get over 9/11 versus the appropriation and fetishization of minority cultures from the US that needs to be respected but many times isn't. Though the US is getting better when it comes to racial diversity in Hollywood and storytelling, when it comes to foreign others or foreign enemies, there's still room to grow. In the previous section, we've talked about Red Devils from Red Scare propaganda films about the Vietnam War, the Soviet enemies in the latter part of the Cold War, antagonists in the Middle East, and North Korea post 9/11. We've also discussed that during the Hays Code, one popular role for actors of color was that of villain, as they couldn't be in relationships with the white actors on set, who were most of the time the main characters. This led Anna May Wong, for example, and other Asian American and Asian actors to be portrayed as dragon ladies or unsavory women, or women who end their lives because of a white guy. Even during the golden age of Westerns, Indigenous Americans were ironically seen as outsiders, needing to be tamed by white cowboys to make room for colonization. The most recent examples I can personally think of when it comes to foreign others are the villains in the pilot of the series Blind Spot from 2015, where there's a Chinese terrorist named Chow that has to be killed, and Cited in Lost, who started out as a subversive representation of an Arab man on American television, but then was put down later to make room for the white characters. Anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiment was so strong during the early 2000s that The Office parodied this with the character of Michael Scott thinking the IT guy is a terrorist. Earlier this year in January, Arab-Australian poet Omar Sacker wrote Bluey in the Genocide, a poem about how even in a show about cartoon dogs, there's pro-military propaganda about a sad boy dog named Rusty whose dad is fighting in some desert killing presumably Arab dogs. It's important to note that the US isn't the only country that makes pro-military propaganda in tandem with the government. Bluey is made with Ludo Studios, but also with the BBC and the Australian government. When I think of the foreign other in media, I always tend to think of Sacha Baron Cohen's The Dictator, which I don't defend and think is wholly a net negative in the world, but I do think that his speech about if America was a dictatorship rings particularly true here. Imagine if America was a dictatorship. You could let 1% of the people have all the nation's wealth. You could help your rich friends get richer by cutting taxes and bailing them out when they gamble and lose. You could ignore the needs of the poor for healthcare and education. Your media would appear free, but would secretly be controlled by one person and his family. You could wiretap phones, torture foreign prisoners. You could have rigged elections. You could lie about why you go to war. You could fill your prisons with one particular racial group and no one would complain. You could use the media to scare the people into supporting policies that are against their own interests. Why are Americans so anti-dictator? So far, we've primarily discussed intentional propaganda made with the US government and military, as well as purposeful media censorship to promote traditional values, which consequentially, whether intentionally or not, led Hollywood to be very conservative and white during its golden era. But in this section, I like to argue that almost, if not all, popular American entertainment media exports made with or without intention to work as propaganda help to uphold the American gaze and reinforce US cultural norms as superior, such as English language supremacy, consumerist culture, American brand awareness, and how, since much of the art made in the US is pro-American and pro-white by default, the dissemination and proliferation of these images help to reinforce a social order in which the US reigns supreme. So first, let's talk about TV. TV shows, from those on the Disney Channel to adult sitcoms to tween series like Vampire Diaries, Supernatural, and Gilmore Girls, to hard-hitting dramas like Grey's Anatomy, Law & Order, and X-Files, and everything in between, all work to export US cultural norms. I'd say shows aimed at tweens have a bigger impact because they show integral parts of American life, like family and school dynamics, relationships, fashion, the suburbs, major US cities, car culture, drinking culture, and explore social taboos in the US. In addition, young brains are more impressionable, and one is able to even form nostalgic memories around these series they grow up with. Riverdale, Pretty Little Liars, 13 Reasons Why, To All the Boys I've Loved Before, Twilight, High School Musical, and more all have had global impact. Some bigger than others, but each of them helped to export US society and culture, specifically high school culture, to a young demographic. And though audiences may not be actively swayed to think the American suburbs are great or that New York City is the center of the universe, foreign audiences and markets are constantly exposed to US media whether they want to be or not, and whether they're influenced by it or not. It's just ever present. And I think the repetition of these images have the potential to be harmful when it comes to internalizing the American gaze and growing up to view the US as somehow better than your own country, or at least cool, when that sentiment should be questioned. There's no harm in exposing international audiences to American high school life or the suburbs or the nuclear family and other American lore, but when it's oversaturated and worse depicts foreign people like Fez, Raj, Lane Kim, and others in said media as less than or as side characters or as weird, and puts white faces and feelings first, it all helps reinforce an unjust hierarchy and help to shape the minds of the viewers watching either domestically or internationally. This type of media paints this picture that the US is mainly just white people, and that not only hurts non-white people in the US but abroad as well. For example, people don't think I'm American in Brazil or in the US, because that's not the image the US exports to its citizens domestically or the global community. Not only that, but how does this image of the weird foreigner in US media affect actual foreigners watching in other countries? It creates cool in-groups and odd out-groups and normalizes the white Americans as default and everyone else as other. Brazil actually instituted a law in the early 2020s that stated for streamers to operate within the country, they needed to create a minimum number of Brazilian series and movies that employ Brazilian actors and production teams, and I think that's true as well in other places to help balance the amount of American media. On January 16th of 2024, the Brazilian laws 14814 and 14815 were published after receiving approval by President Lula da Silva. The laws established an obligation to exhibit Brazilian works in cinemas and on paid TV. The topic had been under discussion since last November, when representatives from the Brazilian audiovisual sector presented demands to protect the local TV and movie industry from competition from American cinema and streaming services. The reintroduction of quotas is expected to have a more significant impact, as these quotas ceased in 2020, and their absence is pointed out as one of the reasons for the significant drop in the market share of national works during this period. In addition, in France, there's the Tout Bon Law, which was introduced in 1994 in order to combat the increasing usage of English in advertisements in other areas in the country. Broadcast musical works are subject to quota rules under a related law, not the Tout Bon Law, whereby a minimum percentage of television shows and 35% of songs on the radio must be in the French language. And music videos are another aspect of soft power, which I think is important to highlight, that can be just as powerful as films and TV, especially because they center around American entertainers and American celebrity culture. It's one thing when you follow fictitious characters on a screen, it's another thing entirely when you have famous artists becoming international celebrities and entertainers, mostly performing in English and showing off their houses in the Hollywood Hills or New York City and speaking from an American viewpoint. Thus, entirely at no fault of their own, their art, songs, music videos, and albums and the singers themselves become soft power tools and beneficiaries of imperial court privilege. Whether intentionally or not, American celebrities, specifically white celebrities, help to spread American culture through the globe and normalize it. They become cultural brand ambassadors, and sometimes they do lampoon the US in their work and speak out about injustices and highlight the ways in which the US has failed as an experiment in democracy, which is great. But imperial court privilege isn't something that you can choose to be apart from because it's privilege. It's not something you can choose to partake in. American English-speaking white celebrities benefit from U.S. cultural imperialism, English language dominance, and from being from the richest nation in the world. As we'll see in the last section, there's specific gatekeeping in Hollywood that works to keep out non-English artists, non-American music, non-white entertainers from ever reaching the same amount of fame and recognition in the U.S. as their white American peers, and it's all done very purposefully. And that's highly hypocritical since the U.S. doesn't seem bothered by exporting their art all over the world, but when foreign artists try to penetrate the American market, it's a big deal, and they're met at times with resistance and ignorance. Of course, this is changing and things are progressing, but it's a history we should acknowledge because there's a lot of improvements to be made. One example I think a lot about is Taylor Swift's brand identity as an American artist on an international stage. A big part of her marketing is that she's the all-American girl. She's got that red-lipped classic thing that you like, typical Miss Americana. She sings about American high school, prom, cars, Hollywood, especially earlier in her career, and lately she's sung about the last great American dynasty. And that's no fault of her own, that's her life, it's who she is, and she's free to express that in her music, but it doesn't mean that these themes don't have bigger political implications. Her being the biggest face of American culture right now says something to the world of how the US wants to be portrayed and who the US uplifts. And I sometimes wonder, what does Taylor Swift's American presence mean when it comes to who can be the biggest and wealthiest singer in the world? I know it's not that deep and audiences are smarter than you think. You know, I'm not the first person to question US cultural imperialism and the proliferation of American images abroad. I mean, even a lot of American media deals with how entitled Americans are. And to give American media credit, they don't let us get away with it. It gets clowned on a lot. See I Love Lucy when Lucy goes to Europe, or this line in Finding Nemo.
Humans think they own everything. Probably American.
Now there is a father.
And even in Modern Family. A lot of the time, US ignorance and entitlement is the butt of the joke, especially in recent times, and these problems are being addressed, specifically when it comes to casting. But I don't know, something about it all just rubs me the wrong way personally, but let me know what you think down below. Anyway, I'm not saying she's a bad person because of the themes in her music or for being famous, but I just want to say it's not surprising that a blonde, blue-eyed white woman with a wealthy upbringing is now a billionaire. To conclude, there's immense soft power in the seemingly benign TV series, music, books. Colleen Hoover, I'm looking at you, because they're the most unsuspecting vehicles of spreading US cultural norms and values, this type of fluff entertainment. These forms of entertainment are not only predominantly in English, but many export American values, independence, the entrepreneurial spirit, unbridled capitalism, mass consumption, brand loyalty, heteronormativity, whiteness, xenophobia, and US tourism to various filming locations and cities. And even if the intention is to make the audience question these values and question US supremacy like Succession and Breaking Bad, they still leave the viewer, both domestic and international, as seeing these people as heroes, or at least as badass. When it comes to the American celebrity as an archetype, through the power and wealth of that position, it becomes so much easier to get audience members around the world engaged because there's a face to the product. And since there's incentives to not speak out against the government or nationalism, it's hard for these cultural ambassadors to even speak freely. And with capital incentives, gives them less of a reason to question the international social order that helps make the wealthy complicit. The last component of the American gaze in U.S. cultural imperialism is when it comes time to recognize international and non-white American artistry and talent, which the U.S. is notoriously bad at. And I think American awards given by U.S. entertainment institutions like the Academy and even MTV to foreign artists are important in that they highlight that this isn't a fair cultural exchange between the U.S. and the rest of the world, but rather this is a world in which the U.S. dictates who can get their gold seal of approval. And though in the grand scheme of things, the world is vast and wide, and in the age of social media and the internet, non-American entertainers are easier to find than ever, and international performers are finally getting their flowers. Making it in the American market is still huge for many filmmakers, actors, and musicians because the US is so exclusionary, and thus being in the in-group is coveted. Awards are a way to systemically and structurally exclude those seen as unworthy. Historically, this meant Black people and other non-white people, as well as out LGBTQ+ folk, women, and and disabled people. And this still rings true today, though groups like the Academy are trying to diversify, as well as the VMAs have created new categories for foreign artists. So let's start with the Oscars. Though Bong Joon-ho is correct in that the Oscars are not an international film festival, their opinions of films don't dictate my status as a director and storyteller. It doesn't mean that there's no cultural capital to be gained from being recognized by the largest cultural imperialist nation in the world. The American entertainment market has been so hard to break into purposefully because of an aversion to non-English language art, to non-white faces, to anything foreign, that making it there is a huge feat. Jackie Chan was given an honorary Oscar, and in his speech he even said that his father said to him, "Son, you have so many awards, but when are you going to get one of these?" Michelle Yeoh famously has had a long career that doesn't just include Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and Everything Everywhere All at Once, and yet people were just discovering her because of an Oscar. Ironically, by making the Oscars so exclusionary, it only makes getting an award as an outsider more coveted and special, even though in the grand scheme of things it may just be an Oscar and not a Palme d'Or. It holds the same weight as an international award because the US treats itself as the center of the world and culture. Even though winning an Oscar or even being nominated, unfortunately, especially if you're non-white and non-American, doesn't mean you'll be booked and busy. That's why it's not enough to just have more actors of color and of different backgrounds in Hollywood, but also filmmakers, production teams, casting directors, and agents, etc. Most recently, I'm Still Here is starring Oscar nominee Fernanda Montenegro is getting Oscar buzz, and that's huge as no Brazilian film has ever won an Oscar. Though it's sad that it's taken this long to get another nomination or at least buzz, I hope something comes of it. When it comes to music awards, recently there was the MTV's VMAs, in which fans around the world can vote for their favorite acts online. For Latin American artists, there's been the Best Latin Award, which was first introduced in 2010 under the name Best Latino Artist. The award was created to replace Los Premios MTV Latinoamerica, which closed in 2009 but went from 2002 to 2009. The Best K-pop category was introduced in 2019, even though K-pop was huge internationally long before 2019. The category Afrobeats was introduced in 2023, and Tyla, the winner of this year's category, actually made a point to say that the continent of Africa has so many other genres of music.
African music is so diverse. It's more than just Afrobeat.
Similarly, K-pop isn't just pop music. There's rap, hip-hop, rock, etc. that should also be recognized. The same with Latin American music, which is a huge umbrella term. But I guess they are voting for the act and not the genre. I don't know. I just think that maybe there should be a few more categories. In general, the US, which dominates the global market and box office sales and Spotify listens, has a lot of catching up to do when welcoming foreign artists. Even white Canadians have to pretend to be American to get recognition in the entertainment industry, like in Hollywood. Imagine how hard it is for actors and singers of color or from lesser parts of the globe. However, things are changing. Bad Bunny became the first non-English language act to win a VMA for Artist of the Year in 2022, and with the power of the internet, it's easier than ever to get to know artists and media outside of the US and in languages other than English. I do think the US isn't as powerful as they once were when it comes to cultural imperialism due to the decentralization of entertainment, and I think that's generally a good thing. In this video, we discussed both intentional propaganda made by the US government in tandem with production studios as well as soft power, and how, though a lot of it is unintentional, all art from the US that's exported around the globe does work to further push an American worldview and American culture and values, even if it's just because it's in English. Well, at least most of it. And how being tied to the imperial core gives American art certain prestige and power that other entertainment media isn't afforded. And though it's no fault of the art itself, the popularity of American media abroad isn't a coincidence, and we should all think deeper about how US cultural imperialism isn't an equal exchange of cultures and knowledge, but rather reinforces a global hierarchy in which American media is universal and art made outside of the imperial core is other, and even worse, struggles to find an audience in the US, a country that's fine with exporting their sitcoms and music to the globe, but that until recently was very homogeneous and exclusionary, and at times still is. Though things are getting better and generally audiences today in the US are more primed to accept foreign media than years prior, there's still a long way to go. And lastly, to highlight, it's important not to infantilize audiences both in and outside of the US, as we can all think for ourselves and see past propaganda, and a lot of this isn't even a secret, it's just open knowledge. It's just something we should, again, again, think more deeply about in order to open our own minds to diverse stories and cultures around the world. So that's it for this one. I hope you liked it. If you have any foreign, non-English, and non-American media you'd like to suggest, whether it be songs, musicians, movies, list them down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.